woman stands silently in the darkness, watching a parked car from a distance. Inside, a young couple laughs, completely unaware that in just seconds, their lives will be violently and permanently changed. Without warning, headlights slice through the night. The figure begins moving closer, step by step, slow and deliberate, like someone who has done this before, someone who knows exactly how this will end. Then, suddenly, gunshots erupt, shattering the quiet stillness of the night. The peaceful silence is replaced by chaos, echoing across the empty road with a violence that feels sudden, precise, and terrifyingly controlled. But this wasn't just a random act of violence. It was the beginning of something far more calculated, something that would spread fear across cities, leaving behind confusion, terror, and a mystery no one could easily explain. Because the killer didn't just disappear into the night. Instead, he reached out, taunting police, sending cryptic messages, and demanding attention in a way that turned fear into something much more personal and unsettling. And even today, decades later, his identity remains unknown. One of the most chilling questions in criminal history still lingers. Who was the Zodiac Killer, and how did he vanish without ever being caught? Welcome to Unimaginable True Crimes. Here, we expose the unimaginable, one case at a time. Before the fear, before the headlines, life in Northern California felt calm and predictable. Quiet communities where people trusted their surroundings and never imagined the danger could be hiding so close to home. In places like Vallejo, young couples often drove out to secluded roads at night, searching for privacy, peace, and moments of connection far away from the noise and expectations of everyday life. For many, these late-night drives were harmless traditions, simple escapes filled with laughter, quiet conversations, and the kind of freedom that only came with youth and the illusion of safety. Among those enjoying that life was Darlene Ferrin, a young woman known for her warmth, her kindness, and a personality that seemed to bring light and energy into every space she entered. Friends described Darlene as outgoing and deeply compassionate, someone who made others feel seen, valued, and comfortable, often leaving a lasting impression on everyone she met. She worked hard, cared deeply for those around her, and carried a sense of joy that made her presence unforgettable, even in the most ordinary moments of daily life. That night, she wasn't alone. Sitting beside her was Michael Mageau, a quiet teenager navigating life completely unaware that he was about to become part of a story that would haunt him forever. Michael was more reserved, less outspoken, but like many his age, he found comfort in simple moments, especially those spent away from the pressures and expectations of the outside world. To them, it was just another ordinary night, a drive, a conversation, a pause in time that felt safe, predictable, and completely free from any sense of danger. But somewhere in the darkness, someone was watching, waiting patiently, observing patterns, movements, and moments when people were most vulnerable and least likely to expect what was coming. This wasn't impulsive, it wasn't random. The person behind these actions had already begun shaping something far more disturbing, something planned, controlled, and deeply intentional. In nearby neighborhoods, nothing seemed out of place. Families went to bed, doors were locked, and people believed tomorrow would arrive just like any other ordinary day. No one knew that a series of attacks was about to begin, one that would stretch across multiple locations and leave an entire region searching for answers. And unlike most crimes, this one wouldn't end quickly. It would unfold slowly, across time, leaving behind a trail of fear, confusion, and unanswered questions. In those early moments, everything still felt normal. The quiet roads, the distant sounds, the calm atmosphere, all of it hiding what was about to happen beneath the surface. It's often in these ordinary moments that the most unexpected events occur, when nothing feels wrong, when no warning signs appear, and when everything seems exactly as it should be. Darlene and Michael had no reason to be afraid, no indication that they were being watched, studied, or chosen as part of something much larger than themselves. And that's what made it so unsettling, because the danger didn't announce itself. It waited quietly, blending into the darkness until the moment it decided to act. At that point, there were no headlines, no warnings, no patterns anyone could recognize, just isolated moments that hadn't yet connected into something more terrifying. The idea of a serial offender hadn't even entered the conversation. There was no reason to believe that these quiet roads would soon become something far more dangerous. Everything about that night felt routine, predictable, familiar, the kind of night that begins and ends without leaving any lasting impact. But hidden beneath that sense of normalcy was something else entirely, a presence, a plan, and a sequence of events already beginning to unfold. Moments like these often pass without memory, but sometimes they become the final moments before everything changes. And for those involved, there is no warning, no signal, no second chance to understand what's about to happen. Because by the time the realization comes, it's already too late. The stillness of the night, once comforting, would soon take on a completely different meaning, one tied not to peace, but to fear. And what seemed like an ordinary setting would soon become the location of something deeply disturbing. A place that once represented privacy and quiet would be remembered for something far darker. Because sometimes the most dangerous places are the ones that feel the safest, and the people who seem the most ordinary can hide the most unsettling intentions. At this point, no one could have predicted what was coming next. No one could have imagined that this moment would mark the beginning of one of the most infamous cases in criminal history, a case that would span years, cross cities, and challenge investigators at every turn. A case that would introduce a name the world would never forget. But at this moment, that name didn't exist yet. Only silence, only darkness, and a night that was about to change everything. Because somewhere nearby, the person responsible was already moving into position, and what began as an ordinary night was about to become something unimaginable. It was July 4th, 1969. Fireworks lit up the skies across California, filling the night with celebration. But far from the crowds, something far darker was quietly unfolding in the shadows. Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau drove into Blue Rock Springs Park, a secluded area known for its isolation, a place where couples went for privacy, never expecting that danger might already be waiting. The parking area was nearly empty. No movement, no witnesses, just the quiet hum of the night, broken only by distant echoes of fireworks fading into silence. Inside the car, everything felt calm. Their conversation was quiet, ordinary, completely unaware that they were no longer alone, and that someone else had already entered their space. Minutes passed before headlights appeared in the distance, slowly approaching, cutting through the darkness with a steady, deliberate movement that felt too controlled to be accidental. The vehicle pulled in behind them and stopped. No one stepped out, no sound followed, just a silence that lingered longer than it should have. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Another car, another person passing through, but something about the stillness, the waiting, began to feel unsettling. Then suddenly, the car drove away, disappearing back into the darkness as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind confusion and a brief sense of relief. For a moment, everything returned to normal. The tension faded. The quiet night settled back in, giving no indication that anything was wrong. But just minutes later, the same headlights returned, this time moving with purpose, pulling back into position behind them without hesitation. The driver stepped out slowly. His movements were controlled, deliberate, almost rehearsed, like someone following a plan he had already carried out before. Michael assumed it was a police officer. The man held a flashlight, shining it directly into the car, blinding them before they could even react. The bright beam concealed his face completely. They couldn't see who he was, but in that moment, something felt unmistakably wrong. Without a word, the man raised a gun. There was no warning, no hesitation, just a sudden, violent shift from silence to action. Gunshots exploded into the night, shattering the stillness instantly. Glass broke, echoes rang out, and the calm atmosphere was replaced by chaos. Michael was hit almost immediately. Pain surged through him as confusion turned into panic. He didn't understand what was happening or why. Darlene tried to react, to move, to escape, but the attack was relentless, leaving no time to process what was unfolding. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the gunfire stopped. Silence returned, but this time it carried a completely different weight. The attacker turned away and began walking back toward his car, calm and unhurried, as if nothing unusual had just taken place. But then he paused. He turned back toward the car as if reconsidering something unfinished. And then, without hesitation, he fired again, ensuring that the damage he had done was complete. This second round of gunfire felt even more deliberate, removing any doubt that this attack had been planned with precision. Moments later, he was gone, driving away into the darkness, leaving no immediate trace behind. Inside the car, Michael was still alive, barely, injured, disoriented, and struggling to understand what had just happened. Somehow, he managed to call for help, his voice shaking, fragmented, filled with urgency as he tried to describe the unimaginable. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but what they found confirmed that this was no ordinary incident. Darlene Farron would not survive her injuries, turning what began as an attack into a confirmed homicide. Michael, against all odds, survived, but the trauma of that night would stay with him for the rest of his life. At first, investigators treated it as an isolated case, a violent act with no clear connection to anything larger. But that assumption would not last long, because the details began to match something else. Another case, another attack, another unanswered question. Then, weeks later, a phone call came in, one that would completely change the direction of the investigation. The caller spoke calmly, claiming responsibility not just for this attack, but for others as well, linking multiple crimes together. He provided details that had never been released to the public, information only the killer could possibly know. And then, in a moment that would define the case, he gave himself a name: the Zodiac. A name that would soon appear in headlines, police reports, and conversations across the country. But despite the name, despite the claims, investigators still had almost nothing concrete to identify him. Only fear and the growing realization that the killer was far from finished. Before we continue, if you've been following the story so far, please take one moment to support the channel. Like this video, turn on notifications, and subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes. Within hours of the attack, investigators began reconstructing the scene, collecting shell casings, documenting positions, and trying to understand how such a calculated act could unfold so quickly and without interruption. Michael Mageau became their only direct witness. Injured and shaken, he described a man who seemed calm, controlled, and completely unbothered by what he had just done. But his view had been limited. The flashlight had concealed the attacker's face, leaving investigators with only fragments, height, build, and a vague impression that offered little certainty. Still, something stood out: the method, the location, the execution. It all pointed toward a pattern investigators had seen before, but hadn't yet connected. Months earlier, another couple had been attacked on a similarly isolated road. At the time, it seemed like a tragic but isolated incident. Now, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Same type of victims, same environment, and the same unsettling sense of control. Before investigators could fully process this connection, the killer made his next move, one that would transform the case entirely. 3 letters arrived at local newspapers, each one filled with cryptic symbols and claims of responsibility that immediately drew public attention. The writer demanded that the messages be published, threatening further violence if they were ignored, turning fear into something immediate and unavoidable. For the first time, the case moved beyond police reports and into the public eye, where fear spread quickly and speculation began to grow. At the center of these letters were ciphers, complex codes designed to hide meaning while inviting attention and challenge. Experts and amateurs alike attempted to decode them, filling pages with theories, patterns, and guesses that led nowhere. Then, unexpectedly, a breakthrough came from an ordinary couple, a schoolteacher and his wife, who approached the ciphers with patience and logic. They managed to decode part of the message, revealing something far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. The killer claimed he was collecting victims as part of a larger purpose, suggesting a belief system that extended beyond simple violence. This revelation changed everything. The Zodiac wasn't just killing, he was constructing a narrative, one that gave his actions meaning in his own mind. Yet even with this insight, his identity remained completely unknown, leaving investigators with understanding but no answers. Weeks turned into months as the investigation expanded, drawing in multiple agencies and increasing pressure to find the person responsible. Then, just as attention began to settle, the Zodiac struck again, proving that the threat was far from over. This time, the attack happened in daylight, destroying the illusion that darkness or isolation were necessary for his actions. A couple relaxing near a lake was approached by a man wearing a strange hooded costume, his identity hidden, his presence immediately unsettling. He spoke calmly, as if following a script, before restraining them with careful, controlled movements that showed no hesitation. The attack that followed was deliberate and deeply personal, carried out with a level of focus that suggested planning rather than impulse. Before leaving, he marked the scene, leaving behind a message that confirmed his identity and connected the crime to his growing legacy. By now, it was clear that the Zodiac wanted recognition. He wanted his actions to be seen, understood, and remembered. Investigators began to realize they weren't just pursuing a criminal, they were dealing with someone who thrived on attention and control. Every move they made seemed anticipated, as if the Zodiac was watching from a distance, always one step ahead. Then another letter arrived, continuing the pattern and deepening the mystery. Another cipher followed, more complex than the last, pulling investigators further into a psychological game. Each message added pressure, forcing law enforcement to respond publicly while still struggling privately to find answers. And with each new letter, the sense of urgency grew stronger. Because the Zodiac wasn't slowing down, he was escalating, both in his actions and his communication. Then came another turning point, one that would bring the investigation closer than ever before. A taxi driver in San Francisco picked up a passenger late one night, unaware that this routine ride would become something far more dangerous. Moments later, the driver was shot, turning a public space into yet another crime scene. This time, witnesses saw the suspect clearly, walking away calmly, showing no urgency, no fear. Police responded quickly, but a miscommunication during dispatch caused confusion about the suspect's description. As a result, officers unknowingly passed by the suspect without stopping him, missing a critical opportunity. It was the closest they had come, and still it wasn't enough. Days later, another letter arrived, confirming what investigators feared. Inside was a piece of the victim's clothing, proof that the sender was indeed the killer. It was a chilling reminder that the Zodiac was not only watching the investigation, he was controlling parts of it. Fear spread quickly. Communities changed. People became more cautious, more aware, more afraid. Despite the pressure, investigators continued pushing forward, determined to identify the man behind the crimes. They built profiles, analyzed patterns, and followed every possible lead. But no matter how close they seemed to get, the Zodiac remained just out of reach. Then, unexpectedly, a potential suspect emerged, someone who seemed to align with parts of the profile. A name began to circulate quietly among investigators. At first, the connection seemed promising, details that matched, behaviors that raised concern. Investigators began digging deeper, examining his background and movements. But the deeper they looked, the more complicated the picture became. Because in this case, every answer seemed to create new questions. Just when it seemed like progress was being made, the trail went cold again. New leads continued to emerge, but each one followed the same pattern: initial promise, followed by uncertainty and eventual dismissal. Tip lines flooded with names, theories, and suspicions, overwhelming investigators with possibilities that rarely led anywhere concrete. Some suspects appeared convincing at first, matching descriptions and timelines in ways that seemed too close to ignore. But as evidence was reviewed, those connections began to unravel, leaving behind more doubt than clarity. It became a cycle, hope rising, then falling, repeated over and over again. Meanwhile, the Zodiac continued sending letters, maintaining his presence even when he wasn't physically striking. Each message varied in tone, some cryptic, some threatening, but all designed to command attention. And every new letter reignited public fear, reminding everyone that the case was far from over. Investigators realized they were dealing with someone who understood not just crime, but perception. The Zodiac wasn't just committing acts of violence, he was shaping how those acts were experienced and understood. Every move law enforcement made seemed to be anticipated, countered, or manipulated. Patterns appeared, then disappeared, leaving investigators chasing something they couldn't fully define. The case stretched across multiple jurisdictions, complicating communication and coordination. Critical information was delayed, misinterpreted, or lost, creating gaps that the Zodiac seemed to exploit. And within those gaps, he remained invisible. Forensic limitations of the time added to the challenge, offering few reliable tools for identification. Investigators relied heavily on intuition and persistence, trying to build a complete picture from incomplete evidence. Still, one question remained at the center of everything. Who was the Zodiac Killer? Was he hiding in plain sight, blending into everyday life without suspicion? Or was he someone completely unexpected, someone no one would ever think to suspect? With each passing day, the answers felt further away. Yet the case refused to disappear because the fear it created never truly faded. Somewhere, the Zodiac still existed. Whether in reality or memory, his presence remained. And the truth behind his identity stayed hidden, buried beneath years of evidence, speculation, and unanswered questions. As the years passed, investigators returned to the evidence with fresh determination, believing that something, no matter how small, had been overlooked in the early stages of the case. This time, their focus shifted to the letters themselves, examining not just the words, but the physical details hidden within the paper, ink, and structure. Every symbol, every line, every imperfection became important, each one holding the potential to reveal insight into the person who had written them. Handwriting experts were brought in, carefully analyzing the way each letter was formed, searching for patterns that might point toward a specific individual. What they found was unusual, evidence suggesting that the writer may have been deliberately altering his natural handwriting to avoid identification. This raised a troubling possibility. The Zodiac wasn't just aware of investigations, he understood them well enough to manipulate the process. It meant that every message wasn't just communication, it was strategy, carefully constructed to mislead and confuse. Then came a potential breakthrough. Fingerprints recovered from one of the letters, offering a rare physical link to the sender. The prints were partial and imperfect, but they represented something tangible in a case filled mostly with theory and speculation. Investigators compared them against existing records, hoping for a match that could finally identify the killer. But no match was found. leaving the evidence frustratingly incomplete and the investigation no closer to resolution. Still, the discovery mattered. It proved the Zodiac was not flawless, that he could make mistakes like anyone else. Witness descriptions were revisited, combined and refined to create a clearer profile of the suspect's physical appearance. The image that emerged was unsettling in its simplicity, a man who looked completely ordinary, someone who could easily go unnoticed. That ordinariness became a problem because it meant he could exist anywhere, blending into crowds without raising suspicion. The investigation grew more difficult, not less, as the suspect became harder to distinguish from the general population. Then attention shifted toward a specific individual, a man whose background and behavior raised significant concerns. His name appeared repeatedly in discussions, reports, and witness statements, drawing increasing attention from investigators. The more they examined his history, the more connections seemed to appear, patterns that felt too close to ignore. He had a past that included troubling behavior, incidents that suggested a capacity for the kind of violence seen in the case. More importantly, he possessed knowledge of codes, weapons, and tactics, skills that aligned with what investigators had observed. For a brief moment, it seemed like everything was coming together, like the mystery might finally have an answer. But as evidence was tested and verified, inconsistencies began to surface, weakening the case against him. Fingerprints didn't match, timelines conflicted, key details failed to align in ways that investigators couldn't ignore. And just like that, the strongest lead began to fall apart, leaving behind more questions than answers. Once again, the Zodiac remained unidentified, slipping back into the shadows of uncertainty. Still, the letters continued to arrive, maintaining a connection between the killer and the investigation. Each message served as a reminder that the Zodiac was still present, watching, thinking, and possibly waiting. Even in silence, his influence lingered, shaping the direction of the case without direct action. Then came one of the most complex ciphers yet, a message so intricate that it would remain unsolved for decades. The cipher seemed to mock investigators, suggesting that answers were right in front of them, hidden within patterns they couldn't decode. Experts attempted to solve it, but every effort failed, adding another layer of frustration to an already complex case. As time passed, public attention began to fade, replaced by new stories and new concerns. But for those directly connected to the case, the passage of time changed nothing. The questions remained just as strong. Families of the victims continued to live with the uncertainty, carrying a sense of loss that had no clear resolution. For them, the case was not history, it was ongoing, present, and deeply personal. And for investigators, it remained unfinished, a problem that had never been fully solved. Somewhere within the evidence, they believed, the truth still existed, waiting to be discovered. Years later, new investigators reopened the case, bringing fresh perspective and renewed determination to the search for answers. Old evidence was retrieved from storage, carefully preserved but never fully understood in its original context. Advancements in technology offered new possibilities, allowing investigators to examine details that had once been invisible. Fingerprints were digitized and reanalyzed, compared against expanded databases in hopes of finding a long overdue match. But once again, no match was found, reinforcing the mystery rather than resolving it. Attention turned back to the letters, searching for trace evidence that might reveal something new. Investigators focused on areas like stamps and adhesives, wondering if DNA could be recovered from places previously overlooked. Partial DNA samples were identified, but they were degraded and incomplete, making reliable identification difficult. It was progress, but not enough to bring the case to a conclusion. At the same time, independent researchers began examining the case, driven by fascination and a desire to uncover the truth. Books, documentaries, and analyses emerged, turning the Zodiac into a cultural phenomenon as well as a criminal case. But despite all the attention, the core issue remained: the lack of definitive evidence. The identity of the Zodiac Killer continued to exist as a question rather than an answer. Multiple suspects were proposed over the years, each one gaining attention before ultimately being dismissed or questioned. Some names became widely known, while others remained hidden within investigative files and private research. Each theory raised hope, suggesting that the mystery might finally be solved. But under closer examination, those theories often fell apart, unable to withstand scrutiny. The Zodiac seemed to exist somewhere between reality and myth, a figure defined as much by mystery as by fact. Then, decades later, one of the original ciphers was finally solved by a team of dedicated codebreakers. Their work revealed the hidden message, providing new insight into the killer's thinking. But the message offered no identity, no location, and no direct path to solving the case. Instead, it reinforced what investigators had long suspected, that the Zodiac sought attention and control above all else. Even in silence, he continued to influence the narrative, shaping how the case was understood. And in that sense, he remained powerful, even decades after the crimes had taken place. Because the truth was still just out of reach, hidden within layers of time and incomplete evidence. Some believed it would eventually be discovered, waiting patiently within the details. Others feared it might already be lost, buried too deeply to ever be recovered. Still, the case remained open, a sign that investigators had not given up. Because one fact remained undeniable: the Zodiac had never been caught. And without that resolution, the case could never truly be closed. It existed as an unfinished story, one without a clear ending, a name without a confirmed identity, a face that had never been fully seen, a story that refused to conclude, and a truth that remained hidden, just beyond reach. Because sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are not the ones we solve, but the ones that remain unanswered, leaving behind questions that continue to echo through time, doubt that never fully disappears, and a silence that says more than any answer ever could. Because even after everything, the most important piece of the puzzle was still missing. After years of investigation, one truth became impossible to ignore. The Zodiac Killer had never been officially identified, leaving one of the most infamous cases in history without a confirmed suspect. But that didn't stop investigators, journalists, and independent researchers from forming their own conclusions, each attempting to piece together the fragments left behind. Over time, certain names surfaced repeatedly, individuals who seemed to match parts of the profile, drawing attention and speculation from both the public and investigators. These individuals often shared key traits, connections to locations, knowledge of codes, or behaviors that aligned with what was known about the Zodiac's methods. Some believed the evidence pointed clearly toward one particular suspect, arguing that the patterns were too strong to ignore. Others pushed back, emphasizing that suspicion alone could not replace concrete proof, especially in a case built on incomplete evidence. No confession was ever obtained, and no piece of evidence directly linked any suspect to all of the confirmed crimes. Without that connection, the identity of the Zodiac remained officially unknown, despite decades of investigation and analysis. Still, investigators worked to reconstruct the events, building a clearer picture of how the crimes were likely carried out. Patterns became more visible: isolated locations, targeted victims, and carefully controlled environments that minimized risk for the attacker. The attacks followed a consistent structure, suggesting planning, preparation, and a level of discipline not often seen in random acts of violence. He approached calmly, often creating a false sense of authority or normalcy before revealing his true intentions. Then, without warning, he would act, quickly, decisively, and with a level of control that left little room for resistance. Afterward, he disappeared just as efficiently, leaving behind confusion, fear, and a lack of clear evidence. But what made the Zodiac different from many offenders was what followed the attacks. He documented his actions, claimed responsibility, and communicated directly with the public and law enforcement. The letters were not just messages, they were part of a larger performance designed to maintain attention and control. Through these communications, he ensured that his actions would not be forgotten, embedding himself into public consciousness. Investigators began to believe that attention itself may have been a primary motive, as important as the crimes themselves. By controlling the narrative, the Zodiac extended his influence far beyond the crime scenes. As long as people continued to talk about him, analyze him, and search for him, he remained present. Even without a confirmed identity, his name carried weight. Even without a face, his image existed in the imagination of the public. Even without justice, his impact remained undeniable. Yet within all of this, investigators believed the truth still existed, hidden somewhere within the evidence. A person who planned carefully, choosing moments and locations with intent. A person who acted methodically, following patterns that revealed discipline and control. And a person who disappeared without leaving behind a clear path to follow. The result was a pattern without a confirmed identity, a case defined by what was known and what remained missing, a story that moved forward without ever reaching a true conclusion, and a mystery that continued to resist resolution even as technology and investigative methods advanced. Because sometimes the truth is not revealed through confession or capture. Sometimes it exists only in fragments, scattered pieces of information that never fully come together. Pieces that remain separated by time, lost connections, and incomplete evidence, waiting for someone, someday, to bring them together into a complete picture. But until that happens, the case remains open, defined by uncertainty rather than answers. And the Zodiac remains exactly what he has always been, a shadow within the history of crime, present but never fully understood. A figure defined not by identity but by mystery, and a name that continues to exist without ever being fully explained. In the years that followed, the Zodiac Killer case slowly faded from major headlines, but it never truly disappeared, remaining one of the most haunting and unresolved investigations in criminal history. For law enforcement, the case remained officially open, revisited periodically, re-examined with new tools, yet never fully resolved despite decades of effort. For the families of the victims, however, the passage of time changed nothing, as the loss they experienced remained as real and painful as ever. They were left with questions that no one could answer, forced to live with uncertainty instead of closure. A kind of silence settled around the case, not the absence of attention, but the absence of resolution. Justice, in the traditional sense, was never achieved, leaving behind a gap that could not be filled. Over the decades, countless theories emerged, each attempting to identify the man behind the Zodiac name. Some theories gained widespread attention, while others remained confined to smaller circles of researchers and investigators. Each new claim brought renewed interest, but also renewed skepticism, as the evidence rarely proved conclusive. Even with advancements in forensic science and technology, the case continued to resist a definitive answer. No arrest was ever made, no conviction was ever secured, and no clear closure was ever reached. What remained instead was a mystery that continued to echo through time, influencing how people understood crime, investigation, and uncertainty. The Zodiac Killer was never officially identified, leaving his true identity hidden behind layers of evidence, speculation, and time. And as the years passed, the possibility of a definitive answer seemed to grow more distant. Yet the impact of the case remained, etched into history as a reminder of how some questions may never be fully answered. It became more than a case, it became a symbol of unresolved truth, a story that continues to raise questions, challenge assumptions, and capture attention even decades later. Because for the families of the victims and for those who continue to search for answers, justice will never feel complete without the truth. If this story held your attention, like the video, subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigation. Your support helps these stories reach people who need to hear them. What drives someone to erase their identity and start a new life after committing the unthinkable? In our next investigation, we uncover the chilling story of a man who fled across borders but couldn't outrun the truth.